Hi there, I'm Jason, and today I'm going to tell you how to save your plants. This is a very layered topic, and I want to note that it's also not always possible. In nature, plants come and go, and so that has to do with your indoor plants and your outdoor plants, and there's a number of different reasons this can happen. I'm going to address some issues and give you some tips on how to keep your plants thriving and how to bring them back if it's possible. Let's get started. So when it comes to plants, and today I'm going to be touching more on terrestrial plants. They are different than epiphytic plants. So terrestrial means it's plants that have roots that grow in the soil or into the earth. And epiphytic plants, like your Phalaenopsis orchid or Tillandsia, those roots are different. They have different functions, and it's a whole nother world. A lot of those roots are used to mount themselves up in the air onto trees. We are talking today about plants that grow roots into the soil. I have this Philodendron here, which is funny. It's actually a combination of the two. These plants can climb trees, and they actually have epiphytic roots, and they have terrestrial roots. Let's pretend that this is a house plant. Let's say it's a Ficus labrata, or it's one of your potted plants on the patio. Your plants have a root system, and in that root system are thicker roots, the roots that you more easily see when you pull a plant out of the ground. Those roots are more for anchoring the plant. They do have an ability to absorb some nutrients as well. Around those thicker roots are these tiny little hairs, and those are the root hairs. They're most abundant at the edge of the canopy of your tree, like right below that. So like if this is your tree, right below the edge of the canopy is where these root hairs are most abundant, and they have the highest capacity to absorb water for your plants, as well as the nutrients. Some of these root hairs even have relationships with fungi in the soil. There's a whole world of fungi in the soil, and bacteria, fungus, all kinds of stuff. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, there's about 2 billion living organisms in a teaspoon of living soil. It's a lot of organisms. When it comes to potted soil and the plants that you have in your house, that soil is not real soil. It's not the kind of dirt that's in your landscape. It's more a combination of different types of organic matter, like tree bark and like compost and worm castings. There's perlite. There's a bunch of different things in there so that your terrestrial plant can put its roots down, put the root hairs out, and actually live and exist indoors. So say you have a plant and it's not doing well. Overwatering indoor plants is the number one cause of plant death. It's also a cause of a lot of potted plants on the patio. Not as common in the landscape, though it can happen, especially if you have clay soil. But there's a whole host of organisms in the soil that can also use the water. So it's not as much of a problem in the landscape as it often is indoors or in potted plants. Say you've overwatered your plant. What that causes, these root hairs that have the highest ability to pull the water out of the soil, they drown. It's too much. If your soil is constantly wet, and you have, say, like a drought-tolerant Sansevieria or Ficus, or your plant roots can reach a point where they, especially if they're not aquatic plants, if it's just a potted terrestrial plant, they need an exchange of water and oxygen in the soil. If there's too much water, you can actually end up drowning the root hairs, and so they drown and they die. And then you pick your plant to pot up, and you're like, oh, there's water in there, but my plant still looks bad. Like it looks like it doesn't have enough water, but the soil is completely wet. So what's wrong? This is what's wrong. The root hairs have drowned, and like they're not alive anymore, and so they're not pulling the water out of the soil anymore. So what is a good remedy for that? One, hold off on the watering. If you come back, every time you come back and that soil is still full of water, just don't water it. You need these root hairs to regenerate. If it's possible, they will and they can. And so just hold off on the watering. And there is something that I do proactively in addition to that. I actually these are peas. You can use peas, fava beans, beans. This has worked for me on a number of different potted plants indoors and outdoors that I've saved. So to get the water out really fast, legumes like the peas and beans and fava beans, they sprout really fast. I'm sure we've all heard of the Jack and the Beanstalk. Part of that is inspired in the nature of the beans in the sense that they do sprout very fast. They'll put their roots down into the soil. They actually fixate nitrogen in the soil, which is also helpful for your plants. But what's nice is if, say, I put a few bean seeds in here, like 4 of them, for example, in this pot, and say this plant was overwatered, the bean seeds will sprout and they'll start absorbing the water while these root hairs are recovering. And then the more that the beans are able to pull some of the water out of the soil, these root hairs have more airspace. They can breathe again. They can, while they're regenerating, they're not just sitting in water drowning over and over again. They can actually have some breathing room. And so the beans actually do work, especially with succulents. I don't know if you noticed in the winter, for example, it gets really cold. There's less sun in the sky because the sun rises and sets very quickly. It's not in the air as long. Your plants don't photosynthesize as well. If a rainy days come by and your succulent's out and it's not in a covered position, it gets wet and the soil is just super wet, especially if you have your plants in like a big pot and you're just like, how do I get the water out? Plant some like fava beans or beans in the soil to really just help alleviate that. And I would just prune those back until the bean prune the bean or pea back either until it's frozen or dies or just until your plant's healthy again. Then you can just cut the whole thing down and let the rest of it decompose in the soil, or you can just pull it out of the soil. Do know that if you're pulling it out of the soil, just make sure not to cross-contaminate if you have like a sickly house plant, because if there was a problem other than just it being overwatered, like say you have a pest in the soil, or there's a virus or disease, you don't want to cross-contaminate like really unhealthy plants with like the rest of your plants. So that's kind of why I brought this disposable glove. At some point, if you have a sickly plant, you will need to repot it. Don't repot your plant while it's sickly. Think of it like if, say, like there's only a couple leaves alive and it's just solid water, and you have to regenerate all of this. If you pull your plant out to repot it, a lot of times that just adds extra stress, enough stress to push it over the edge, and then your plant dies. Also, I wanted to mention that these root hairs, another way that they can pass away is if they've been underwatered. So say you're on vacation for a couple weeks and the soil was like bone dry. It was dry for a long time, so long that the root hairs, they didn't have anything to live anymore. There wasn't that exchange of the water and oxygen, so they dried up. They can die that way too. And so say you come back and you're like, come back, and you like water it, and then it's solid water. Well, there's no root hairs yet to absorb the water, so you'll end up with the same result. So it's patience. If you've underwatered your plant, the way that you're going to save your plant is you're going to water it just a little bit. Let the plant absorb the water, keep a close eye on it, and then water it again and again until you can tell that the plant is absorbing the water, until you see progress here. But if you've let your plant dry out, don't overwater it, because that's the easiest point to overwater it, because you fill up the soil with water and the plant doesn't have root hairs and it never really gets a chance to regenerate them again because there's just too much water in the soil. And if you've underwatered your plant, do make sure not to follow it up by overwatering it. Just give it a little water to bring it back, and then you can start giving it full waterings in between waterings based on whatever type of plant it is. That kind of scenario of your plant's roots drying up is not as common with succulents, so do keep that in mind as well. If your plant's demise has been caused by a pest or a pathogen, you'll end up with different results, or you'll have a different process. One, you want the water and the root hairs, and you want the root system to be as healthy as possible. If you reach a point at which you repot it, use disposable gloves. Make sure to do it in an isolated place so that you don't cross-contaminate it with your other houseplants or your garden. And then look through the roots to see how they are. Make sure there's no mealybugs or scale. Make sure that that you're not just cross-contaminating maybe root knot nematodes. There's a bunch of different types of pests that can be in the soil, especially if your plant's not doing well. So once your plant has revitalized itself to some degree, then it's okay to repot it. And do make sure that when you repot, especially a house plant, that you repot it during the growth season so that your plant's roots can once again fill the pot back up. So most houseplants, you don't want to repot them in the winter because in the winter they're kind of dormant. Most houseplants are tropical plants and they're used to not putting out a lot of growth in cold weather. So when they can tell that your house is getting colder because it's winter, they slow down their growth. And what that means for the root system that you have is that that's going to slow down as well. So if you're repotting your house plants, or a plant that you're saving, make sure to do it in either the spring or the summer, or even the early fall at the latest. And that's when you can repot it, use gloves, try to figure out what's wrong. If the root system seems like it's come back and there's no other visible problem, there's no like abnormal swellings, there's no bugs, then you proceed. Sometimes if your plant has a virus or a type of rot or fungus, you'll see like black spots with a yellow ring around it. That usually is indicative of a virus that has infected your plant. It doesn't always mean that it's a virus that will kill your plant or that your plant can't regenerate its immune system to where it can suppress that virus. There are so many things to be aware of. Just think of like outside how many things there are that can affect your plant. There are things that can affect your plant indoors, and then when it comes, from the growth nursery and it travels to like wherever you buy it from, and then it travels to your house. I mean, your plant's going a lot of places by the time it gets to your house. So there are different things that could have happened. Flying insects could have landed. I mean, so at the end of the day, you really just you want to make sure that you're enjoying your plants. These are in your house to clean the air and make oxygen and make you happy. They're in your garden to make you happy. Know that you can't control everything. Nature is a powerful force, and there's so much good you can do for the world in your garden by taking care of plants indoors and out. They are wonderful additions to our earth and world. But just know that the nature is a full cycle of all these different creatures, and it's just, as a gardener, you do your best. I would recommend that as a big piece of advice. Just do your best and try to enjoy your plants indoors and try your best to enjoy your plants outdoors. They can bring so much joy and life into the world and into your life. So make sure you're doing that. Don't let the pests and diseases discourage you forever. You can get better. You can choose different plants that are like tough as iron. Those plants spark lots of joy. Because they're with us. They're vibrant. They're healthy. And then you, the gardener, if something happens to your plants, take some action to try and save them. Why do I have these? I have neem oil and I have Slego Plus. Part of taking care of your plants is making sure that pests, especially if your plant's in decline, they're more of a target for pests. So know that if the plant's not getting enough light, if there's not enough nutrients in the soil, if the soil is overly wet or overly dry, pests can set in much more easier, because think of the health of your plant is your plant's immune system. That's how it wards these things off. So say your plant's been in decline, pests have set in, you're working to reestablish this root system. Say you do reestablish it. Say this is a succulent, and throughout this process you're noticing, oh my gosh, there's mealybugs. There's scale bugs. What do I do? Know that those bugs exist not only on the foliage, but as well as the roots of your plant. It's often overlooked that the scale and mealybugs can be on your plant's roots. So we spray the top thinking we've got them all, and meanwhile they're like reproducing underground. So in a pot, you have a little bit more control over this. Slego Plus. You want to get the plus because that is the spinosad part of it. It's a bacterium that can attack the mealybugs and scale in the soil and get them off of the roots of your plant. I only use this if you need to, because like I said, there are a lot of beneficial organisms in the soil, both indoors and out, more so outside. But it's all about balancing and keeping the good guys alive. Sometimes the things that we use to control the bad guys hurt the good guys a little bit. So use it if you have to, but only if you need to, or as just a mild preventative. If you're using it indoors and you're using Slego Plus because maybe you notice there's scale or mealybugs on your plant, indoors or outdoors, just poke a couple holes on the top of the soil, take a couple granules, put them in there and cover them up, especially if it's indoors, because they'll mold if you leave them exposed. Outside, you can just sprinkle these under the plants, but it's also good to kind of push them into the soil. Slego Plus. That gets the bad guys in the ground. It does get some of the good guys, so do remember that. But that's how you control mealybugs and scale in the soil. And it also kind of discourages the ants, I feel like, too, because ants are often associated with mealybugs and scale, as well as aphids. Neem oil, this is essentially to get the bugs off of your leaves. If you have indoor plants, make sure to use an indoor insecticidal soap for the foliage of your plant. Outdoors, you can use an insecticidal soap, or you can use neem oil, which is in a lot of insecticidal soaps. Do make sure not to overuse this, because if you overuse it, do know that you're using an oil. It can cause leaf burn. It can also suffocate the leaves if you're overusing this stuff. One thing I like to do, especially if you have aeoniums, and you see the mealybugs on your aeoniums, you can spray all the leaves with this, the neem oil, and then get your water jet and like lightly mist the rosettes to just dilute it a little bit to prevent leaf burn, but also to kind of get the insecticidal soap to drizzle down the stems of your plant so that it gets any little pests that are on there as well. But do know cultural care first. So if you notice a problem, look at like how much light, how many, how much nutrient balance is there in your soil, how are the roots, how's the water, like why is your plant not doing well. Also attack that as well when you're dealing with a pest or a disease. Sometimes if your plant has a really bad disease, it may not get better. And at that point, it's good to like thank your plant for a job well done and compost it. But that point is up to you, If it's just struggling all the time, you're kind of like indoors with your plant all the time and it's struggling, or maybe you're looking at your garden and there's like potted plants and it's just not doing well. You can try to propagate it from the top, especially if it's succulent. Take some cuttings that you can tell are healthy and then try to reroot them. Some viruses and pathogens can follow the plant because it's actually in the tissue into regrowing it, and sometimes they can't or don't. So it's worth giving it a try. Propagate your plant from the top if you can. If you can't do that, I think it's a good job or a good idea to let your plant go if it's just causing you more stress than joy. Remember, at the end of the day, you want your plants are there indoors to clean your air, to make oxygen, to make you happy. They're like your little companions. So you want to be enjoying them, and you want vibrant, healthy plants around you. So I would recommend if your plant's just not coming back, compost it. Our local trash companies, they have the green compost bin, just compost it. And get a new plant, and get a plant that's suitable for your lifestyle. If you travel a lot, you're not home all the time, there's certain plants that are better for you. If you're home all the time but you just don't have time for your plants, there are certain plants, and then there are other plants that need more care and attention. If you're a plant addict and that brings you joy to be taking care of your plants a lot more, do figure out whatever your schedule is, whatever your lifestyle is. Start with a little bit less, and then branch out from there. But make sure that you're happy, that you're enjoying your plants indoors, that you're enjoying your plants outdoors, your garden. There's a whole bunch of things that can fly into your garden. The aphids, like I mentioned. This is spring right now, and if you haven't been looking in your garden, go and take a look. There probably are aphids somewhere. Aphids, to me, are one of the easiest bugs to control. Why? Because you can just spray them off with water. What I do, though, usually, I take an integrated pest approach. I have a very biodiverse garden, and biodiverse encourages a high population of a variety of insects. For example, if you're using certain native plants like Baccharis, that plant by itself attracts over 200 different types of insects into your garden, which is a good thing because they attract soldier beetles and ladybugs, and when you get the good guys coming into your garden, they easily remove the aphids. Your birds eat your aphids, like hummingbirds, like different insects in the garden eat the aphids. So if you're just hosing the aphids off as you see them, by the time the good guys arrive, they'll finish the job. If you notice an aphid ever, and if you have aphids, I would look closely at them. If you ever notice one that's pearlescent in color, or it's like metallic white, that's not a normal aphid color. That means it's been infected by the parasitoid wasp, and that you already have a good guy in that little cluster of aphids. And so I would leave them alone until they've all been parasitized, and then they're like gone. Only turn to these topical sprays if you really, really need to. You can do it as a little prevention, especially if you want to keep those fungus gnats out of your soil. You can spray a little bit of this on the soil of your plants, especially if you have indoor plants. The soil gnats, they love to lay their larvae in the topsoil of your plants. So if you spray a bit of this in the spring as like a control, it helps keep them out of your soil. you know, there are preventative measures, but it's always, you know, what can I do culturally best first to make my plant really healthy? What can I do in the meanwhile while I'm waiting for the good guys, like hosing off the aphids, while I'm waiting, you know, for the good guys to come and control my pest? Because that is the best form of control, because that you have less insecticide and herbicide in your house and in your garden, and you just encourage more of the life that's in your soil. Remember, you know, a teaspoon of living soil can contain up to 2 billion, or 2 billion, I think it was, billions of living organisms in like a teaspoon of soil that's alive. So I do recommend like feeding your soil in your garden, making sure that you are repotting your plants. When you repot your house plants, make sure to do it in the growth season, especially if you're rejuvenating one of your plants. What I mean the growth season is, so a lot of your house plants, the tropical plants, they come from the understories of plants in the jungle, and that's why they do well in less light in your house. Um, their growth season in the winter, when it's colder, they don't put out as much new growth, because why? Because it would freeze or die. So they kind of like, they don't grow as much in the winter. So that's the same for your root system. So when you repot your indoor plants, it's good to repot them in the spring, the summer, or even at the latest the early fall. That way your plant can use the growth season, the season that it would naturally grow larger, to develop this root system back when you repot it. Because often when you're repotting it, you're removing some of the roots, you're adding some new potting soil. Those roots can regenerate and fill in either the same pot or a larger pot that you put your plant in. So do keep in mind to repot your plant also in this season when it's growing. Those are some tips on how to save your plant and keep it alive. Also, how to let go of your plant if you absolutely have to. And remember, some viruses and pathogens you can't really get out of the plant even by propagating it. Oh, and by the way, you can usually tell if it's a black dot with a yellow ring around it. That's usually indicative of a virus infection. Sometimes your plants can reboot their immune system to suppress it. Sometimes they can't. You know, it's up for you, the owner, to observe. But don't forget, remember to enjoy your plants, enjoy your garden, and do your best. And make sure that you're enjoying your plants. They're your little buddies. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And once again, my name is Jason.